We're going to do something really amazing. We're going to take ChatGPT and we're going to let it design a programming language for us. And we're going to program in it. We're going to have ChatGPT build a system for us using its own language. And so we're going to start off by asking ChatGPT to teach us this language, design it for us, show us how it works. And then we're going to start working with ChatGPT to build a language using or to build a system using this custom design language. ChatGPT is going to decide the language. We're going to work with ChatGPT to generate artifacts in that language, and we're going to end up with working code from this. Now, if you're not familiar with the domain-specific language, what a domain-specific language is it's a custom language. It can be a visual language, it can be a textual language. In this case, we're going to ask ChatGPT to generate a language that's based on text to describe different aspects of a piece of software. And we're going to let it pick and choose the parts or aspects of the system that it's going to describe. We're going to let it choose the language for each part of the system, and we're going to have it work with those artifacts. And so let's dive right into it and look at this, because this is absolutely an amazing capability of ChatGPT and something that we can use to change how we think about building software. So we're going to tell ChatGPT, we're going to start off with a prompt here. And this is a pretty complex prompt, but I'm going to go ahead and walk you through it. So I would like you to create a set of interrelated textual DSLs. DSLs are domain-specific languages. This is just an abbreviation. So a set of interrelated textual DSLs to describe software systems. The first DSL should describe requirements in English. There should be traceability. That means there should be a connection to a second DSL that describes the software architecture. The architecture should include a description of major components, data communication pathways, queues, data stores, etc. There should be a mapping from the architectural components down to another DSL describing modules, classes, and functions, and it should support OO or functional designs. The next DSL should map where different concepts from other DSLs appear in code. A final DSL should allow specifying deployment to services ranging from function as a service to platform as a service to infrastructure as a service with or without VMs and containers. Wow. If I had to do this from scratch and design all these languages really quickly, it would take me a while. I don't know if I'd be able to easily do this. Now, we're going to walk through an example. This was about 30 minutes of my time with ChatGPT to build this up. Now, in the initial iterations of the language were done in seconds. So we're talking a minute of time to start generating these DSLs. And you could obviously go and refine them and do a lot of work to design better DSLs that better capture what you want. Or you can even ask ChatGPT, what are the DSLs I should have to describe my system? But in this case, we're going to give it these requirements and we're going to see what happens. So what does ChatGPT do? Sure, I can help you create a set of interrelated textual DSLs to describe software systems as per your requirements. And the first thing we see that it does is it generates a requirements DSL. This is amazing. I mean, think about that. We said, hey, we need a language to describe the requirements. It said, that's fine. I'll generate a language to describe the requirements. And it gives us an initial way of documenting that. It looks kind of reasonable. It's a requirement as a registered user. Now, there's not a lot of detail here yet, and we're going to see it get more detailed in a minute. It gives us an architecture DSL, and it describes a textual format for an architecture. Now, one of the things I really like about this is that it's got this really simple, approachable, typable format, right? It looks kind of like YAML. I could go in and I could type this in to interact with ChatGPT, and I could do that, but I'm actually going to do something that I think is more amazing, which is I'm going to talk to ChatGPT in English, and I'm going to get it to fill in the DSLs for me in a minute. It gives me a design DSL with a next layer of information, code mapping DSL. Now, are these the right DSLs for this system? Probably not. I'd probably go and think through it again more if I was going to do it, but this is a first exploration. Can ChatGPT generate the language that we use to describe and write the software system? And the answer is yes, and we're going to see that. Now, we'll go back at some other point in time, and we'll really think through these DSLs and how we ask ChatGPT to design them to get better ones out of it. But this is a first step in showing that ChatGPT can design its own language that we can use to interact with it. And it can create software systems based on these languages. And it can go all the way from the domain-specific language that it designs, the DSL, down to code. It also gives us a DSL for deployment. and describing different aspects of deployment. So we've gone from a paragraph, let's create some new languages, and now we've got ChatGPT actually generating languages for us. We've got a requirements DSL, we've got an architecture DSL, we've got a design DSL, we've got a code mapping DSL, we've got a deployment DSL. That's pretty phenomenal that the system itself is designing what we're going to work with. Now, maybe these things already exist. I don't know. And if you see that they exist, please put that in the comments. If this is a replica of some existing system, yeah, let me know. Now, could we have used UML? Yeah, we could have used UML maybe to do this, a textual version of UML. But why would we do that when we can have it design our own language and explore that possibility? Okay. So I next said, can you provide the requirements DSL for a system to allow users to post ChatGPT prompts and subscribe to people's ChatGPT prompts to have their own feed? So you can imagine this, like, I want to create a social sharing site, something like Twitter for ChatGPT prompts, where I want to be able to publish prompts and talk about them and subscribe to other people's feeds of prompts and have this integrated feed where there's just all these amazing prompts. And so I'm telling it this is what I want, and I'm asking it, go and create the requirements for that. So now here's an interesting piece of this, right? I'm telling it kind of what I want, but it's going to describe and decide the requirements itself. And so it says, sure. And it starts using its requirements DSL. Now this is phenomenal. Absolutely mind-blowing to me is it designed the language earlier and now it's using the language. But not only is it using the language, it's describing all of the requirements for the system itself based on a simple description I've gotten. And so again, I want to think about the intellectual productivity improvement that we get, the creativity magnification out of this. Like, I am providing it the ideas, but it's going and it's being like my loyal assistant. It's like Jarvis and Iron Man. It's going and this is what I want. Great, go do it. But the creativity is coming from the human and deciding it, but it's making me more powerful as a user. And so doing something amazing from a software development perspective. Let's look at some of its requirements. As a user, I want to be able to post prompts on ChatGPT. The user should be able to create a prompt with a title and a description. The prompt should be saved in the database and displayed on the user's profile. Well, that seems great. That's a prompt that I would probably write. As a user, I want to be able to view my own prompts. The user should be able to see a list of their own prompts on the profile page. The list of prompts should be sortable and filterable by different criteria. As a user, I want to be able to subscribe to other users' prompts. As a user, I want to be able to upvote and comment on prompts. As a user, I want to be able to manage my subscription settings. So it's gone, and we gave it a very simple thing. Can you provide the requirements DSL for a system to allow users to post? It's designed its own language, and it starts using its own language to describe the system requirements. And it's designing requirements that I would probably want for this system, this fictitious system that I'm asking it to design. Great. Now, I noticed a problem in what it was said in one of the requirements. It was talking about posting the prompts to ChatGPT, and I don't necessarily care about that. I just want to have the content. Like, let OpenAI have the interface to that thing. And so I say, hey, the prompts don't need to be posted to ChatGPT, just post it to a website where the users can share great prompts. So I'm giving it more context. This is what I really want. You can imagine working with a software engineering team and they're showing you things and you're saying, no, I want you to change that requirement. But rather than getting pushback, they're going to say, okay. And it says, thank you for the clarification. Here's an updated version of the requirements DSL for a system that allows the user to post prompts on a website and describe to other people's prompts. And it goes and it updates the requirements based on my requirement change. So it's now generating requirements for me. I'm identifying problems in the requirements of things that I want to change. It's updating them, and it's working in its own language. This is the key thing I want to point out here, is that it's making the change in its language. It designed the language, now it's using it. And it's using it to accomplish what I'm asking it to accomplish. Okay, now I ask it, I say, now provide the architecture DSL code for the requirements listed below. And it starts generating an architecture. And what I want to show you is, here's the architecture code. This matches its DSL. Now, I'll be honest, I didn't give it a detailed look. I honestly don't even care if it begins to maybe manipulate or improve its DSL over time based on what I'm telling it. I could get to this end of this 20-minute session and it could come up with some new ideas for its DSL. I mean, that's okay. I'm early in the design, but I'm pretty sure this is actually mimicking the design of the DSL that's specified earlier, and it's creating a design for my application. So it's saying we're going to have a prompt service. We're going to have a subscription service. We see the subscription service right here. We're going to see a feed service. We're going to have a database service. And then it's telling us dependencies. And these are dependencies that make sense. So we have a subscription service. It depends on the database service. Well, that makes sense, right? If I'm subscribing to prompts, I'm going to need to save that subscription somewhere. Same thing with the prompt service. It's depending on this database service. So it's going to have access to the database in order to save the prompts and be able to retrieve them. That's really impressive. It itself is deciding our architecture based on the requirements that we gave it. Well, actually, I take that back. Not on the requirements. We just said, here's the high level, what I want to do. It generated the requirements for us using its own DSL. Now it's generating its architecture DSL, and the architecture DSL is an architecture for a system that maps back to what we would expect for the actual requirements that we gave it, or sorry, that it generated. It generated its own requirements to go and implement this thing. They were correct for what we were trying to accomplish, the system we were designing, and now it's designing the architecture in its own language. Okay, can you add traceability from the requirements to the architecture by improving the DSL? Because I wanted to say, hey, how does this architecture map back to what you said you were going to do in terms of requirements? Can you show that to me? And so on the fly, it goes and it modifies the DSL and its implementation to say, okay, the requirements are now mapped as part of the architectural component. So it's explaining the relationship between the different components and then the requirements, which it's providing a shorthand from. And so it's giving us a shorthand that these should map back to the original requirements that we have. Now, there's some problems with this. I didn't see necessarily a clear numbering of the requirements up here. I guess it's going based on file order. Of these requirements, and maybe it's going on order in the file. There's some various things in there that could probably be improved. And who knows, maybe it's even describing that and telling that to me. But hey, this is very fast. This is a couple minutes of time. It's now created a language for us. We've gotten down to the point of an architecture, and we've got some traceability explaining how the architectural components relate back to the original requirements. Why did it make the decisions it did in terms of architecture? That's what's partly really interesting about this, is this traceability says, hey, the reason that I created this prompt service is to satisfy requirement 1 in the list of the requirements. Okay, that's a really fascinating thing. It's explaining to us how its requirements influence its architecture. And maybe we could do better. We could look at this in more detail, elicit some more interesting things. So now I say, okay, now create a functional design for the system using the design DSL. And that was another DSL that it had, and we get a whole list of functions. Now it's using classes, so maybe that's not what we want, but we're still getting a bunch of functions. We could go and we could interrogate it and do some things probably to manipulate this. But we're at the high-level idea phase, right? We're manipulating a design in real time using a textual language. I could go and directly edit things in this textual language if I wanted to. But where's the fun in that, right? It's more fun to have it just actually work with its own language. But I could go and modify it. I could begin interacting with it using its textual language and learning about it. But it's got all of these different parts of the application, and it explains them to me. All right. Then I say, now can you go and use the code DSL to realize this architecture? How would you go about doing that? And so it says, sure. And so it goes and starts mapping this down in greater granularity to different things that are in the architecture. And it finishes and gets cut off, so I tell it to keep going, and it goes and it maps all this down. So we've gone from a high level down to where it's now saying and dreaming up different capabilities and how they would be mapped into the application sort of at a fine level of granularity. Now, it's going to get lost, and we're going to see that it's going to lose a little bit of this information later, and that's okay because there's all kinds of techniques around that. But I didn't want to get too hung up on being fully consistent in this application. I wanted to let it have some maneuverability in here, and I'll let it forget some things because I also realized that my DSLs maybe weren't the best choice. If I could go back at the end of this, I could have a much better idea, and I will later, on how to build better DSLs or how to explain it to build better DSLs for what I want to accomplish. But it does a really good job of going through and describing all of this stuff using the DSLs. Okay, now let's get to the rubber. Like, where are we going to really meet that rubber meeting the road? We've got all these DSLs. It's designing the system. It's designing the requirements for us. It's creating architecture. It's creating all of these artifacts for us. And, a lot of times we wouldn't even bother like creating some of these. As developers, we might say, I don't want to create that document. Oh, it's such a pain. People complain about these things. They really want to write in code. I'm going to do these things because the fact that I can like iterate from the thought perspective on the idea, and it'll start updating all of the artifacts for me. That gives me so much power to really think through the structure and the design of things. But I'm going to drill down now and go ahead and get to the point of code, because I know a lot of people want to see the code. You say, well, it generated all this DSL stuff, but can it really produce code that matches up with the concepts, the designs that are captured in those other things? So I say, can you provide me a sample implementation of the prompt service you designed using Python Fast API and DynamoDB? And what do we get? We get an implementation. We've got Fast API. We've got Botto 3, which is going to be used for DynamoDB. It's going and implementing it. It's going to be using Pydantic for the data model and basically doing validation, or hopefully we'll see something of that in a minute. So it creates some of the concepts. So it's creating a prompt service for us. So it's creating the prompt service for us. It's explaining it. And I looked at this thing and I said, you know what? We need a better definition for the schemas. There's not really a lot of explanation of the data items and how we would validate them and use them. Like we kind of left that out of our design. And maybe I should have noticed that in its DSL design earlier. So I say, hey, just go and modify the DSLs to add this concept of data. And so it says, okay, let's add a data DSL. And it then promptly goes and, sorry for no pun intended, generates the description of the prompt data item that we're going to be working with. And it provides sensible information on all of it. It's got, every prompt has an ID, a unique identifier. It's a UUID 4. It's text, it's a string. It provides the text of the prompt. It sets minimum and maximum bounds on that prompt that we could go and adjust, but it seems reasonable. It's also got the unique identifier of the user who submitted the prompt. That's obviously going to be another important thing. And if we think back to the requirements that I want to be able to see who's posting prompts and subscribe to others, that's obviously going to be a key important part of a prompt. So it's generating a DSL for describing the data, and it's generating a DSL that really makes sense. It makes sense based on our requirements. And then it's going to go and start updating the Python code. So we told it, hey, we want this because we want better validation. And now it's actually going and it's updating the Python code based on its new DSL description. If you notice, it had UUID 4 as part of it. So it's using that for the Pydantic model here in order to do the validation. It's got the minimum maximum length between 1 and 1,000. So it's actually taking what it described in its DSL and that information it captured, and it's now reflecting it in code. So it's essentially doing code generation based on the DSL. So now we could say it's taking the DSL and that high-level description and it's generating code for it. We could say that it's generating both artifacts to correspond to each other and to be consistent. Doesn't really matter. I'm just going to call it code generation from its own DSL. Pretty amazing what it's doing here. And then it's got the prompt service. It's re-implemented the prompt service, and it's using all of the validation that's up here. That's pretty amazing. And then I looked at it and I realized, what? There's a problem with this. The way that it's currently implemented, there's no aspect of security to this thing. Like, how do we describe security? Maybe we can introduce a DSL for that. And do we really need DSLs for all these things, or do we need them all in one file? I don't know, but I'm erring on the side of multiple DSLs, because with PromptGT, there's always a chance that we will hit our output limit in terms of number of tokens or number of tokens that we can input into it, or the amount of context that it can remember, just from fundamental limitations of the service and the model. So having things in separate files a lot of times helps us get around those limitations, because we can go and reason about chunks of things individually as opposed to having a lot of irrelevant information. So we're going to have a DSL that just describes the security. I asked it to describe the security, and I said, here's why I want this. For example, a standard user should own any prompts they create, and other users should not be able to delete or update them. I actually gave it an incorrect requirement. And I'm going to be curious here. I didn't notice this before. I'm going to be curious looking back over there, see if it actually noticed my mistake and fixed it for me. An admin can modify any prompt. Can you flesh out some possible rules for this new DSL? So it describes a user. It says prompt, operations, create, read, update, owner ID equals user ID. Now this is pretty amazing from a security standpoint. Is it new that I probably made a mistake in my wording and it fixed it? It says in order to create, read, or update a prompt, the owner ID has to match the user ID for the prompt. To read, the prompt's visibility has to be public. So it's generating a new concept that's not currently in our prompt, and this is going to be interesting in a moment. And then it says to delete a prompt, then it has to be private and the owner ID has to be the user ID. So you can't just delete another prompt. It's also kind of generating an interesting condition for me. Basically the idea that I can't delete a prompt that's public because it's already out there. And so it could have been maybe copied or something like that. So I have to unpublish it, make it private in some way before I can delete it. That's kind of an interesting thing that it's building in there. It's like it's creating some idea of how this might work. And it's also adding in this concept of privacy, which is interesting. It then has got admin. They can create, read, update, and delete prompts. And there's no requirement that owner ID or equals user ID or anything like that. So that's really, really fascinating. Okay. So now I asked it, can you add an identity service to the architecture DSL? And it goes through adding an identity service. And I won't go into that. There's not that much interesting stuff there other than the fact that it could do it in its own DSL. Can you use the security DSL information in the new architecture implementation to update the code for the prompt service? And what we'll see is it goes through and updates all of the prompt service to start enforcing the rules that were there earlier. Like if the user ID does not equal the prompt user ID, that's a problem. They have to match up. If you go and you look at a particular prompt, if the visibility is private and the user ID does not equal the user ID of the person that created that prompt, we're going to not let them view that prompt. And so it's actually going through and implementing the security roles or the rules that it described in the DSL. So let's think about it. And I just want to back up for a minute. Look at all of what we've done in this very short period of time. And let's just go up and look at all that's been created. All of this started from a simple prompt. The power in ChatGPT is the creativity that we put into the prompts. That we think through creative sets of constraints that ChatGPT can go and build and do things for us. The more creative we are in the prompt, the more power we have in using ChatGPT. We want to give it a sense of what we're trying to accomplish, and we want to give it maximum freedom. Now, why might we want it to go and describe its own domain-specific languages? Well, one of the challenges that we face when working with a system like this, particularly if we're working with a chat-based architecture, is there's a limited amount of space that we have to describe context to it at any given time. And when we're just describing something like security, we don't want a bunch of unrelated details. We don't want to cut and paste all of our code in order to be able to reason about security. We'd like to be able to cut and paste the important pieces, the relevant information about security into the prompt for ChatGPT so that it can reason on that. We can say, here's what we want. And we provided a concise description that provides the necessary information. And this is what we want you to, how you want to use that context. Generate some code for me, update another DSL. And so by having ChatGPT design the DSL, it can design a DSL that captures only the information that's needed to reason about that aspect of the system. And so we can then go and interact with those more information-dense descriptions of some part of the system. They're high density in terms of information related to a particular aspect or topic or concept within the system, so we can interact with the system more effectively with ChatGPT than if we went and looked at all the code and we said, well, we want to describe security concepts, and then ChatGPT generates a bunch of code and then it's forgotten some rule or something. Well, now we have to go and type it all out again. And if we had the security requirements described in some DSL, we could cut and paste the section. We could say, as you remember earlier, here are the security requirements for this thing. that we described in our DSL. Now we want you to modify to ensure that all of those are adhered to. And there might be a lot of things in there. We could do it as a block of text, but it provides a sort of more concise definition of reasoning about parts of the system, or we can say, go and update just that aspect of the system to incorporate those security rules. Now, based on that artifact, regenerate the other artifacts. And so it gives us a way to, focus down the amount of information that we're working with when we're discussing with ChatGPT, and still be able to take it and add additional information through code generation or other things to actually get real artifacts of real systems.